Welcome to Intro to Biology for Majors, or BIOL 1224. My name is Lindsay Owens, and I'm your instructor this semester. We're going to be working out of a book called Biology 2E. It's an Openstax book, which means it's free. It's available on your Blackboard page, and I've linked all of the necessary chapters within each module. If you need more information on that, I have an entire introductory PowerPoint that you can go to in your Blackboard page as well. This is going to cover Chapter 1, the study of life. So I normally like to start these PowerPoints with objectives, basically things that I want you to walk away having learned from these PowerPoints. And the three objectives in this chapter are being able to recognize the steps of the scientific method. And most of you probably know about the scientific method. You probably heard about this in your high school biology class, but we're going to dig into it a little bit deeper and talk about why it's relevant today. We also want to be able to recognize the parameters of scientific outcomes and to identify the characteristics common to life. So as you probably already know, the scientific method has multiple interrelated parts, including observation, hypothesis, and experiment. Those are kind of the first three. Here you can see an arrow diagram. This actually comes from your book. If you all dig into those chapters that I've linked within Blackboard, you'll actually find diagrams like this in your book that kind of walk you through the scientific method this way. The photo that I've attached here is actually of Sir Francis Bacon, and he is the first person that historians credit with defining the scientific method. So the scientific method is really still relevant today. We use it all the time. In order for research to be accepted, it actually has to be shared within the scientific community. So whether that's medical research, environmental research, scientists often collaborate together in groups and communicate research with other groups as well. This communication has to follow very specific guidelines to make sure that the communication is appropriate. Publishing those research findings in peer-reviewed scientific journals allows other scientists to share ideas and provides scientists with the opportunity to evaluate and test the data analysis provided. So basically, when someone has an observation, a hypothesis, an experiment, they come up with results and they publish those results so that other scientists can then test those results to prove whether or not they're accurate. And that's why we really trust peer-reviewed journals, because these journals have been tested by multiple scientists, not just the one who initially came up with that theory. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the scientific method, and I kind of want to start on the left side of this slide on this table that I've provided. So let's start off with an everyday example of how to use the scientific method. So I'm going to give you an example of turning on a light switch, but the bulb does not light up. So making the observation, which would be the light bulb did not light when I flipped the switch, you have to ask a question. Is the light bulb blown? Then you need to form a hypothesis. The light bulb is blown. Next, you need to make a prediction based on that hypothesis. So in this case, if I replace the light bulb and it lights, then my hypothesis is validated. The bulb was blown. If the bulb does not light, then my hypothesis is invalidated. So next you come up with an experiment, which in this case would just be replacing the light bulb. Then you have results, which you analyze. So in this case, let's say that the new bulb does light up. So in conclusion, your hypothesis would then be supported, meaning that it's validated, the bulb was originally blown, and you would report those results. Now, as you see, you can be sent back if your hypothesis is not validated or supported. You have to go back and try again. So you have a different hypothesis that you start from, and you kind of work your way back down through that. So the scientific method starts with a hypothesis, and now we're moving on to the right side of the slide. A hypothesis is a tentative, falsifiable explanation of an observation. This means that it can be proven either to be supported or not supported. And we don't like to use the terms true or not true, or correct or not correct. In science, we don't always count things as fully true or fully not true. We like to use the terms supported versus not supported. So a hypothesis, again, is a tentative, falsifiable explanation of an observation. Scientists test their hypotheses with controlled experiments, they share the results, and often publish in peer-reviewed journals. So scientific theories actually differ from theories outside of science, and a few scientific theories that we'll kind of talk about are germ theory, the theory of evolution, and gravitational theory. And you've probably heard of all of these before, probably dug into some of them more than others. So some notes that I have here: it is possible to interpret data in many different ways. Definite answers are not always the result, which is what I mentioned in the beginning. As scientists, we don't like to have definite answers. Basically, we don't like to say a hypothesis is 100% correct. We either say our experiment supported or did not support our hypothesis. Observations can be misinterpreted. Human error is absolutely possible within science. We do our best to be non-objective and to be able to answer these questions that we have just from an outside perspective with an open mind, but anything can be misinterpreted. Scientists also generally aim to be objective. They are people and have their own likes, dislikes, and personal biases. Because of this, scientific data may be interpreted in different ways by different scientists, which is why publishing things in peer-reviewed journals is very beneficial. But once again, the things that go into peer-reviewed journals are being published by other people who have their own personal biases. So nothing is 100%, nothing is 1,000% true. But basically, we do our best to be non-biased. So scientific theories are different than hypotheses. So in science, a theory is an explanation for a natural phenomenon broader in scope than hypotheses and supported by a tremendous amount of research. So many people can have different hypotheses about a natural phenomenon, but a theory comes from many of those hypotheses coming together to prove something to be correct in a sense. And like I said in the last slide, we don't like to use the term correct, we like to use the terms validated or supported. So a theory is a very highly validated or supported larger reasoning for a natural phenomenon. Like a hypothesis, theories are potentially falsifiable, meaning that even a theory, something as big as germ theory, evolutionary theory, the theory of gravity, they are potentially falsifiable. Facts are repeatable observation that everyone agrees on. So when we come up with these large theories that we all sort of base as fact in our everyday lives, they are repeatable experiments and observation that hundreds and thousands of scientists, pretty much everyone agrees on. So in a sense, we can talk about gravitational theory this way, the theory of evolution this way, and germ theory this way, which is why we mentioned those three in the last slide. I do have some notes here. Scientific theories are well tested and highly reliable scientific explanations of natural phenomena. They unify many repeated observations and data collected from lots of different experiments and lots of different scientists over years and years. So we all know that biology is the study of life. So let's really dig more into life itself. What is life? How do we know that cats are alive and rocks are not alive? Biology is the scientific study of life, cells being the basic units of life. Every organism or living individual consists of one or more cells. So the notes that I have on this slide are that biologists have identified various traits common to known living organisms. Although non-living things may show some of these characteristic traits, only living things show all of them. And we're actually going to cover 7 properties of life in the next slide. And those are the traits that we're talking about here. So they're common to all known living organisms. So whether it be a plant, an animal, they all share these 7 traits and properties of life. All living organisms are made up of one or more cells, which are considered the fundamental units of life. And organisms can be either unicellular or complex, but they are all individual living things. So this slide just goes over the 7 basic properties of life that I mentioned in the last slide. The first being order, the second being sensitivity or response to stimuli, the third, reproduction, the fourth, growth and development, 5, regulation, 6, homeostasis, and the 7th is energy processing. And in the next several slides, we're going to dig into each of these individually. So the first property of life that we're going to talk about is order. And order kind of goes from atom to organelle. And this is the way that your book kind of discusses these properties of life. And on the top of this slide here in the corner, this little purple diagram that I've given you, this is kind of how your book organizes this as you read along within the book. I just have these linked within the PowerPoint so you can kind of look at what I had to say versus what you have to read. Basically, order is the first property of life, and organisms are highly organized structures with one or more cells, which is an orderly way to be organized. Even very simple organisms are complex beings. Inside of each cell, atoms make up molecules, which is, why the book kind of organizes things this way. Atoms being the smallest unit of life, they make up molecules. Molecules go together to form organelles, and organelles function within cells. This picture here is actually from your book. This is just a toad. It represents a very highly organized structure, structure in this case meaning an organism, consisting of cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems. So please keep in mind, one of the notes I have here is that non-living things may show some but not all properties of life. So for example, I have a crystal of snow listed here. And if you think about it, they are organized. They contain atoms and molecules, but since snowflakes cannot reproduce, they do not display all other properties of life. So in order to be considered a living thing needs to have all 7 of these properties, order being the first. So in the last slide, we covered order from atom to molecule to organelle. And in this slide, we're actually going to still continue talking about order, but we're going to talk about it from cell to tissue to organ. So like I mentioned, this is going to be how your book sort of organizes things here on the left, very similar to the diagram you saw on the last slide. So in organisms with many cells, similar cells form tissues. Tissues create organs. Organs work together to form organ systems. These form organisms like humans. So when you're thinking of cell, tissue, and organ, you can think of something as simple as cells working within cardiac tissue that then form the heart together. So this is kind of how things work within very complex systems as well as very simple systems. So I wanted to find a way to really sum up what your book is talking about here, and also what I've covered. So on the left side, you're going to kind of see a pyramid structure, starting on the bottom with atom, which is what we started covering whenever we started talking about order. So talking from smallest to largest, atom would be your smallest. Atoms form molecules together. Molecules work to form macromolecules, macro meaning large, molecule meaning the same thing. So basically forming a large string of molecules. Together, those will form organelles, which then work within cells. Cells form tissues. When they are alike, those tissues then form organs, which form organ systems that make something that's an organism, like for example, a human. So this slide is basically labeled as from a single organelle to the entire biosphere. Living organisms are parts of a highly structured order. So the notes that I have for this slide, multicellular organisms such as humans are made up of many cells. The cells in multicellular organisms may be specialized to do different jobs and are organized into tissues, such as things like connective tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, all things that you've heard of before. Tissues then make up organs, such as the heart, the lungs, the brain. These things then carry out specific functions needed by the organism as a whole. So this slide just kind of gives you a visual depiction of what we've been talking about. It also sums up exactly what I said in the last slide. So order from smallest to largest, smallest being atom. We go all the way to organism is what we've talked about so far, but this slide even goes further to talk about populations, communities, ecosystems, and biospheres. And please keep in mind that in this slideshow, we're just basic touching on everything. I'm kind of giving you an introduction to what this course is going to be and what we're going to learn. We're going to dig a lot more into this type of stuff later in the semester. But I just want to go ahead and mention it now so that you know that all of these things go together. So let's talk about this diagram a little bit just by going through what I have stated here. So organisms, like in this diagram, a human being, are highly organized structures with one or more cells. Even very simple organisms are complex. Inside each cell, which is depicted here, atoms make up molecules. Those molecules turn into organelles, which aren't pictured here, but it's multiple molecules together. in multicellular organisms, similar cells here will form tissues, like those we mentioned in the last slide. Tissues then form different organs. This is the stomach, for example, which then will work within organ systems to overall work for an organism. Then we kind of dig into the fact that organisms make up populations, right? So we can use an example of human beings. So we form a population together of humans. Nearby population will form communities. So in this case, we can say populations of people. We have populations of animals in our areas. These are communities. While communities go together to form ecosystems, which would be plants, animals, all of the things surrounding us that create our everyday life. All of these ecosystems of the earth form our biosphere. So this is very big picture, obviously, and like I said, we'll hit on this a lot more at the end of the semester, but just know that all of these things sum up now. They all make up our everyday life. They're all very relevant to everything that we're going to cover in this course. So this slide gives you some examples, like visual depictions of what we've talked about so far. So we've talked about how we have complex systems like human beings. Even the mouse and the fish that you see on the right side of this slide would be considered complex. Living things such as that are considered complex systems. But we can talk about single-celled organisms, like in this image we have a bacteria, or sperm, for example, being a single-celled organism. They are still complex in its sense because they are still formed by atoms and cells, but they're a single cell, and so they're a lot more simple whenever you're comparing it to something like a mouse, a fish, or an organ or a human, right? So tissues, we talked about different types of tissues. This top one is a muscle tissue. The bottom here would be nervous tissue. Organs, we talked about lungs. The brain is an organ formed, by different tissues that all work together. And then an organism would be a mouse or a fish or a person. So that's kind of what we've been summing up to this. Okay, so we're finally done with order. So let's move on to the second property of life that all living things have to exhibit. And the second property of life here would be sensitivity or response to stimuli. So we're not going to dig super deep into this like we did with order because it's pretty much what we're saying. So organisms have to respond to diverse stimuli. For example, plants can bend towards a source of light, they can climb on fences or walls, and they can respond to touch. So this image that I used for the slide is from your book. The leaves of this plant are actually sensitive. They instantly droop and fold when touched, and then after a few minutes, the plant will return to normal. So something as, simple structurally as a plant versus a human being is still responding to stimuli, whether that be light, water, wind, weather. Things have to be able to respond to be living. Okay, so the third property of life that we're going to cover is reproduction, which is an extremely important one. So single-celled organisms like those that we talked about a couple slides ago, our examples were bacteria and sperm. They reproduce by first duplicating their DNA and then dividing it equally as the cell prepares to divide to form new cells. And this is, again, something that we are going to dig way deeper into in future PowerPoints, but just know that reproduction happens at a single cell level as well as a multicellular organism. So multicellular organisms often reproduce by producing specialized reproductive germline cells, and they form new individuals. So when reproduction occurs, genes containing DNA are passed along to an organism's offspring. So that's a very fancy way to give you a very blatant example. Multicellular organisms such as humans, they produce the egg and the sperm, right? So those would be your reproductive germline cells. They're specialized. They form new individuals, meaning they come together to form a fetus, right? So when reproduction occurs, the genes from mother and father containing their DNA are then passed along to the organism's offspring, that fetus. Okay, and the fourth property of life we're going to cover is growth and development. And believe it or not, this image is from your book. This cat does not look happy, but it is, feeding its babies there. So growth and development is genetically driven. Genes provide instructions to direct cellular growth and development. In this way, a species is young will exhibit many of its parental characteristics. So the description of this image here is, although no two look alike, these kittens have inherited genes from both parents and share many of the same characteristics. So let's go ahead and talk about the notes that I have here. Biologists have identified various traits common to all known living things. Although non-living things may show some of these characteristic traits, living things show all of them, right? So we've already touched on this in previous slides, but I'm just mentioning it again. So non-living things may in some ways show growth and development, but it doesn't mean that they're living unless they show all 7 of these properties that we're discussing. Okay, so the 5th property of life we're talking about is regulation. Even the smallest organisms are complex and require multiple regulatory mechanisms to coordinate their internal functions, also to respond to stimuli and to cope with environmental stresses. 2 examples of internal functions regulated in organisms are nutrient transport and blood flow. So regulation, the reason that they showed a polar bear here, the description of this image, which is also in your book, is that polar bears and other mammals living in ice-covered regions maintain their body temperature by generating heat and reducing heat loss through thick fur and a dense layer of fat under their skin. So often, actually, animals that live in either of the poles in extremely cold climates they have black skin. So there's very specific traits for organisms that provide regulation in order to maintain their survival in these harsh environments. So the 6th property of life we're going to discuss is homeostasis, which I'm sure that you've heard this word before. I tried to give you kind of an image here on the right that just shows you, a very basic understanding of homeostasis. Homeostasis is the process by which a cell or organism maintains equilibrium. A thermostat is an analogy for how life maintains its internal consistency. Homeostasis is not just about temperature, though. So, for example, organisms also fluctuate around their optimal nutrient, salt, and water balances. So, homeostasis doesn't just mean that they're staying in a comfortable temperature range. Homeostasis means that living things have to be able to fluctuate with their environment. They have to have the correct nutrient intake. They have to have the correct salt intake and water balances to maintain that survival. Okay, and then the last property of life we're going to discuss here is energy processing. All organisms need a source of energy. Some organisms capture energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy in food, which would be plants as the main example there. Others, like us, use chemical energy within food molecules for energy. So this image also came from your book. This is a California condor, and it uses chemical energy derived from food to power its flight. California condors are an endangered species. They have this bird in particular has a wing tag that helps biologists identify this individual. So this is a good diagram provided by your book. This is a diagram that shows the biological levels of organization of living things. From a single organelle to the entire biosphere, living organisms are parts of a highly structured hierarchy. So we start in this diagram with organelles, which we know we started with atoms and molecules, with our previous slides. But organelles here, it says the nucleus is dyed blue in these onion cells. It's an example of an organelle. So the nucleus within these cells, these little blue dots that you see within the outer shell of these cells, that nucleus would be an organelle. This is an image of human blood cells. Both of these things are things that you'll see in class during our labs. This is an example of human skin tissue, organs and organ systems. So organs such as the stomach, intestines, we mentioned in the past slides, lungs, the brain, they make up the human organ systems, but in this case, the stomach and intestine make up the human digestive system. So let's move then on to organisms, populations, and communities. So in a forest, each pine tree is an individual organism. Together, those pine trees make up a population of pine trees, and all the plant and animal species in the forest together comprise or make up a community. And ecosystems, this is an example. The coastal ecosystem in the southeastern United States includes living organisms and the environment in which they live. So not only is it the living organisms, the things that we've discussed that contain those 7 properties of life, but also the environment in which they live. So that means the water where they live, the sunlight, the overall atmosphere where they live. And then here you have the biosphere, which encompasses all of these individual ecosystems, which could be anything from the polar ice caps to the savanna. All of the ecosystems on Earth form together the biosphere. So moving away from the 7 properties of life, let's start talking about the tree of life, which includes 3 main branches. So this is a good diagram, just basically showing you and kind of color coding these 3 main branches for you. You do not by any means have to know every single thing listed on this diagram. It is just a good visual depiction of what we're going to discuss. So the first is bacteria, the second is archaea, and the third is eukarya. And most of what we're going to discuss in this course are going to be things contained in both bacteria and eukarya. Actually, bacteria and archaea used to be one together rather than 2 separate branches of the tree of life. But archaea, actually, these organisms in particular, they live in extremely harsh environments, so they are genetically and physically different enough from bacteria that they need their own branch of this tree. So the 3 main branches of life are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. The 2 that we mostly cover in our course are going to be bacteria and eukarya. And it gives you a little star here. This is animals. This is us. So we are within the same field here as slime molds and ciliates and plants and fungi. So this is a good visual example of what we're going to hit on in the next few slides. Okay, so like I mentioned before, we're going to go ahead and talk about prokaryotes, which would include the 2 branches of life that are bacteria and archaea, which I mentioned they used to be one branch together. They're now separate, but prokaryotes are single-celled or colonial organisms. Colonial also means single-celled. They do not have membrane-bound nuclei. So that means that their nuclei is not resting within membranes within those cells. In contrast to that, the cells of eukaryotes, which would be on this end of the spectrum here, so plants and animals, they do have membrane-bound organelles and a membrane-bound nucleus as well. Eukaryotes include things like plants, animals, and yeast and fungi. So that being said, this is once again a very broad introduction to what we're going to dig into a lot more later in this course. But prokaryotes and eukaryotes, those are 2 very key terms that are good to know. And once again, you can separate them by prokaryotes being single-celled bacteria and archaea, and eukaryotes being multicellular, everything that has to do with plants and animals and fungi. So these are, examples from your book. These images represent different domains, A being bacteria. This image itself is a micrograph. It belongs to the domain bacteria. And remember how I said that archaea actually are living in extreme environments. So this is an extremophile living in this hot vent belonging to the domain Archaea. C here is a sunflower, and D obviously is a lion. These are both part of the domain Eukarya. So eukaryotes are generally larger, more complex cells with DNA enclosed in a nucleus. So that's a good way to distinguish prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. Okay, so these are the 4 key takeaways from this PowerPoint, and this is how I like to end all of our PowerPoints for our chapters. I like to begin them with the objectives, the things that I want you to learn, and then I like to end the PowerPoints with, once again, key takeaways and what you should walk away with. So the first from this chapter, chapter 1, is that scientific method involves observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and data. The second being scientific outcomes involve collaboration and peer review, which means, multiple scientists collaborating together, and peer review being journals that things are published in once they've been agreed upon by several scientists, and collaboration within the community. Properties of life, which are the 7 properties that we talked about, that something has to exhibit these 7 properties in order to be considered living. They include order, sensitivity, reproduction, growth, regulation, homeostasis, and energy processing. And then the 4th key takeaway is that the tree of life has 3 main branches, and I would like you to take away that those branches are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So that is the end of the chapter 1 slideshow. Thank you for sitting through it. Congratulations.